The letter came priority mail, stamped in red ink across the top, final notice of Leon. I remember standing in my driveway in December, breath fogging in front of me, snow just starting to dust the mailbox post, thinking somebody had mixed up my address with a stranger's file. Then I opened it and saw the number. $4,200 in accumulated fines. Violations dating back 4 months, none of which I'd ever received a single notice about. Violation number 1, dated August 14th. Unauthorized discharge of water onto common area infrastructure, resulting in damage to community newsletter distribution box. That was my kids. Mason and Ellie, 10 and 8, had a water gun fight in the front yard that spilled out onto the sidewalk near the entrance. And yeah, they soaked the plastic newsletter box at the subdivision's front gate. I remember laughing about it that day. I did not remember getting a notice, a warning, or so much as a dirty look about it. Now, 4 months later, in the dead of winter, it was apparently worth its own line item on a lien threatening my house. I'm John Wells. 10 years Army, logistics and equipment maintenance, 2 deployments, discharged as a staff sergeant with more discipline drilled into me than most people know what to do with. I run a small contracting business now, single dad to 2 kids who are the reason I get up in the morning, and I own a house in a half-finished luxury subdivision called Falcon Ridge Estates, which sounded a lot nicer in the brochure than it turned out to be in real life. Falcon Ridge was supposed to have 65 homes, a clubhouse, a pool, walking trails, the whole package. 4 years in, we had 26 houses built, a construction fence around half the lots, and a developer named Griffin Holt who, under the fine print of our HOA bylaws, still controlled the board because less than 75% of the lots had sold. That's called a declarant control period, and most homeowners don't read that part of the paperwork closely enough to know it means the guy selling you the house also runs the association that governs you, usually through whoever he appoints. The person Griffin Holt appointed to run daily HOA business was a woman named Kathy Pennington. Kathy didn't own a construction company or have any background in property management that I ever found. What she had was an unnerving talent for turning a clipboard into a weapon, and a knack for making every interaction feel like you were already guilty of something. She drove a white Escalade with a Falcon Ridge Estates HOA magnet on the door that she'd clearly ordered custom, and she treated the unfinished half of our neighborhood like her personal kingdom. I want to be clear about something before I keep going. I am not a guy who causes trouble. 10 years of following orders and giving them will do that to you. I pay my dues on time, I mow my lawn, I keep my paint colors within the approved palette even though half those approved colors look like variations of beige. People like Kathy Pennington see that kind of discipline and mistake it for weakness. They think a quiet man is a compliant man. That mistake was about to cost her everything. Let me back up to August for a second, because that newsletter box violation is where this whole mess actually started, even if I didn't know it yet. It was one of those brutal late summer afternoons, the kind where the kids get restless and the only cure is soaking each other with the garden hose attachments shaped like sharks that Mason begged me for at the hardware store. They'd been chasing each other around the yard for 20 minutes, and at some point the fight drifted toward the subdivision's entrance, where the little wooden post holds the plastic newsletter distribution box that Kathy insisted on installing so residents could stay engaged with community announcements, which in practice meant nobody read it, and it mostly held soggy coupon flyers. Ellie nailed Mason with a direct hit that went wide, and about half a gallon of water ended up on and around that newsletter box. I saw it happen. I jogged down, apologized to absolutely nobody because nobody was around, wiped the box down with my shirt, and took the kids inside for popsicles. End of story, I thought. 2 days later, I got what I assumed was a routine community flyer in my mailbox, one of maybe 6 pieces of HOA paper I get a month, mostly about landscaping deadlines and pool hours. I skimmed it, saw nothing addressed to me specifically, and tossed it in the recycling with the rest. Turns out that flyer, according to Kathy's later paperwork, was a documented verbal warning converted to written notice regarding my children's water gun activity. I never saw anything that said my name on it, never got a call, never got a knock on the door. But somewhere in a file at the HOA office, apparently, that innocuous afternoon became violation number 1 in a pattern that would eventually try to take my truck equipment. Fast forward to December, and the real story starts. The first significant snowfall of the season rolled in on a Thursday night, the kind of storm the local news spends 3 days hyping and then delivers about 5 slushy inches of. Still, for our neighborhood, it was a big deal. Falcon Ridge Estate sits on a ridge, hence the name, with a long private access road that the county doesn't plow because, technically, it's HOA maintained. That means whether people can get to work, get their kids to school, or get an ambulance up the hill depends entirely on the neighborhood having working snow removal equipment. I happen to own a serious plow attachment for my pickup truck, along with a portable generator I bought years ago out of old habits from my Army days, when losing power wasn't an inconvenience, it was a planning failure. I keep both in good working order in my garage. I'd used the plow twice before to help clear the shared access road when the HOA's contracted plow truck broke down, purely as a courtesy to my neighbors. Nothing official, no compensation, no contract. I just didn't want anybody sliding off the ridge because Kathy Pennington was slow calling a backup contractor. That Thursday night, the snow started around 6. By 8, my phone rang. It was Kathy. "John, this is Kathy Pennington with the board. We have an emergency situation on the access road, and I need you to bring your plow equipment to the HOA maintenance shed immediately." I told her I was happy to help clear the road myself, same as always, no problem. She said no, that wouldn't work, because under the newly adopted Emergency Resource Directive, all homeowner-owned equipment capable of snow or debris removal was subject to temporary requisition by the association during declared weather emergencies, and I needed to drop the plow attachment and my portable generator at the shed for community allocation. I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone, genuinely confused, because in 4 years of living there I had never heard of an Emergency Resource Directive, never voted on one, never received any bylaw amendment about it. I told her I hadn't seen that policy anywhere in our governing documents. "It was approved by the board in a special session," she said, like that settled it. "It's for the safety of the whole community, John. I'd hate for anyone to think you're not a team player during an actual emergency." There it was, the soft threat wrapped in community spirit language. 10 years in the Army teaches you to recognize when someone's giving you an order dressed up as a request, and this was exactly that, except this person had no actual authority over me beyond whatever she'd convinced herself she had. Still, I want to be honest. At that point, I didn't fight it. Snow was coming down. My neighbors needed the access road clear, and if the board genuinely had passed some emergency measure while I wasn't paying attention, I wasn't going to be the guy who let old Mrs. Castellano slide off the ridge because I was busy arguing bylaws in a blizzard. I loaded the plow attachment and the generator into my truck bed and drove them to the maintenance shed myself. Kathy met me there in a parka with fur trim that looked like it cost more than my truck payment, holding a clipboard, naturally. "I just need your signature here," she said, acknowledging temporary voluntary transfer of equipment to the Association for Community Emergency Use. I read it. It said voluntary donation of equipment, not temporary transfer, and it didn't specify a return date. I told her I wasn't signing anything that said donation, and I wanted it in writing that this was temporary and that I'd get everything back within 48 hours of the snow event ending. She sighed like I was the unreasonable one, crossed out donation, and wrote temporary use in the margin without initialing the change, and told me that was the best she could do tonight because she needed to get the equipment operational before the road became impassable. Naive move on my part, letting that slide. But it was 9 at night. Snow was coming down harder, and I figured worst case, I'd sort out the paperwork later. I drove home without my plow or my generator, and honestly didn't think much more about it that night. 2 days later, the snow had mostly melted off the roads, and I called the HOA office to arrange picking my equipment back up. That's when I first met Diane Foster properly, though I'd seen her name on financial disclosure documents before as the HOA treasurer. Diane was maybe mid-50s, precise, wore reading glasses on a chain, and ran the actual books for the association separately from whatever Kathy handled on the operations side. When I called about my plow and generator, Diane pulled up her equipment log and told me politely but firmly that according to her records, John Wells had donated both items to the HOA in August. 4 months before the actual snowstorm. I told her that was impossible. I still had the plow on my truck 2 nights ago. This had happened Thursday. Diane went quiet for a second, then said she'd need to check something and would call me back. She didn't call back that day. She called back 3 days later and her tone was different. Careful. She said there seemed to be some discrepancy in the paperwork and she wanted to meet in person. That was the first crack. And I want to walk you through how this thing escalated, because it didn't happen all at once. It happened in 3 distinct waves, and each one taught me a little more about what Kathy Pennington was actually running out of that maintenance shed. The first wave was the plow itself. When Diane and I sat down at the small HOA office behind the clubhouse that was never quite finished, she showed me the file. There was a form dated in August with my name typed on it, describing a voluntary donation of snow removal equipment to Falcon Ridge Estates HOA for community benefit. And at the bottom, a signature that was supposed to be mine. It wasn't mine. Anybody who's ever compared my actual signature to that scrawl would know it in about 2 seconds. My real signature has a hard slash through the W in Wells, a habit from signing thousands of supply requisition forms in the Army where you learn to make your signature fast and consistent so nobody can dispute it later. The signature on that HOA form was soft, looping, nothing like mine. I pointed this out to Diane. She got very quiet, pulled out 3 other homeowner files, and compared signatures across multiple documents. 2 other residents, both older, both less likely to scrutinize paperwork closely, had nearly identical soft loopy signatures on similar voluntary donation forms for things like snow blowers, a generator, and in one case, an entire tool shed's worth of extension cords and space heaters. I signed off on the budget report referencing these donations as community assets, Diane said slowly, like she was working out a math problem in real time. I remember approving the line item. I don't remember ever seeing these residents in person to witness a signature. That's the moment Diane Foster stopped being defensive and started being an ally, even if neither of us said it out loud yet. Treasurers keep records because their entire job is proving where money and assets go. When she realized her own approvals had been used to legitimize equipment that was never actually donated, something shifted in her face. I recognized it because I'd seen it in soldiers who realized they'd been lied to by someone they trusted with logistics. It's a particular kind of anger, quiet and cold. I still didn't have my plow back, though. That was wave 1. And at that point, I chalked it up to bad paperwork and maybe Kathy cutting corners under pressure. I genuinely tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, because that's who I am. Wave 2 is when I stopped doing that. About 10 days after the first snow, we got hit with a second system, smaller, only 3 inches, but enough that the county issued a winter weather advisory and half. The neighborhood lost power for about 6 hours when a transformer down the road tripped. This time, I hadn't been asked to bring anything to the shed because I didn't have anything left to bring. But I still had my old backup generator, a smaller unit I kept for exactly this kind of situation. One I hadn't handed over because it was in my basement, not my garage, and Kathy apparently didn't know about it during the first sweep. When the power went out, I ran an extension cord to keep the fridge and a few lights going, standard prepper habits from my Army days translating into normal homeowner life. About 2 hours into the outage, there was a knock on my door. It was one of the HOA's contracted maintenance guys, a young guy named Deshaun, who I actually liked, apologetic look on his face, saying Kathy had sent him to collect any additional emergency equipment residents might be holding back, because the clubhouse needed power for the community to use as a warming shelter. I asked Deshaun point blank if there actually was a warming shelter being set up at the clubhouse. He hesitated, then admitted he didn't think so, that as far as he knew, Kathy just wanted the generator moved to the shed for inventory. That was wave 2, and this time I tested it deliberately instead of just complying. I told Deshaun I appreciated him being straight with me, and that I'd bring the generator over myself once the storm passed, no rush. Then I called Diane. Has the board actually authorized a warming shelter or any emergency shared power plan? I asked her. She checked. There was no such authorization anywhere in the meeting minutes. No vote, no line item, no plan on file. At this point, my Army brain kicked all the way into gear, because this had stopped looking like sloppy management and started looking like a pattern. Somebody was systematically collecting homeowner equipment under invented emergency justifications, funneling it through fake or forged paperwork, and Diane's legitimate signature was being used to launder the appearance of legitimacy on the back end. I decided to actually verify where my equipment had gone, because a plow attachment worth several $1,000s and a generator don't just sit in a maintenance shed collecting dust if someone's motivated enough to steal them through paperwork instead of just breaking into your garage. There had to be a reason, and reasons usually involve someone using the thing. Here's where my old habits paid off. Years ago, after having a trailer hitch and equipment stolen off a job site, I'd started installing small GPS trackers on anything expensive that lived outside my direct control for long stretches. Cheap magnetic units meant for teenage drivers, the kind you can buy off any hardware website. My plow attachment had one tucked inside the frame, more out of habit than any real expectation I'd ever needed. I pulled up the tracker app on my phone that had been sitting dormant since I dropped the plow off at the shed. To my surprise, it still had battery and signal. According to the log, my plow attachment had left the maintenance shed no less than 6 times over the preceding 2 weeks, and every single trip ended at the same location. A cluster of unfinished lots on the far side of the subdivision, where Griffin Holt, our developer, was building 3 speculative model homes he hadn't yet listed for sale. My plow, requisitioned under an emergency directive supposedly for community road safety, had been clearing snow and grading gravel driveways at the developer's private construction sites. 6 separate trips, each lasting 2 to 4 hours, time-stamped clearly. I sat at my kitchen table that night with my laptop, feeling something I hadn't felt since my last deployment, that specific clarity that comes right before you realize you have enough information to actually build a case instead of just having a bad feeling. I called Diane the next morning and asked her, carefully, whether the HOA had any contracts or invoices related to snow or grading services provided to the developer's private construction lots. She pulled the books. There were indeed invoices, 3 of them, billed from Falcon Ridge Estates HOA Maintenance Services to Griffin Holt Development LLC for snow removal and site prep at the model home lots, totaling just under $6,000. The HOA had billed the developer for using homeowner-owned equipment that the homeowners never got paid for or even agreed to loan out. And Kathy Pennington's name was on every one of those invoices as the authorizing agent. That was wave 3, and this is where things stopped being a private dispute and started becoming something with real legal weight. I want to be fair here. Diverting shared assets is bad enough on its own, but using forged signatures to fake voluntary donations, then billing a private company for services performed with stolen homeowner property, and pocketing or funneling that revenue back to the HOA account under Kathy's discretionary control, that's not a bylaws violation anymore. That's fraud. Diane pulled the maintenance contractor's time sheets next, the ones for Deshawn and the two other guys who did HOA grounds work. Cross-referencing those with my GPS logs was almost too easy. Every single time my plow's tracker showed it at the developer's lots, the contractor's time sheets showed the crew clocked in as working on common area snow removal, main access road. They weren't clearing the shared road those hours. They were plowing driveways for houses that weren't even for sale yet, using my truck attachment, and we later confirmed through fuel logs Diane dug up. Gas paid for out of the HOA's community maintenance fund, meaning every homeowner's dues had literally been subsidizing fuel for equipment stolen from one of those same homeowners. I laid all of this out for Diane on her kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, printouts spread everywhere, GPS timestamps next to invoice dates next to time sheets next to that fake signature. She sat back in her chair and rubbed her temples and said something I still think about. I've been treasurer here for 3 years. I thought I was protecting people's money. I think I was just providing cover for someone stealing it. I told her that wasn't on her, that Kathy had specifically exploited the trust built into her role. The same way bad actors in any organization exploit the person whose job is to make things look legitimate on paper. But I also told her I wasn't interested in quietly resolving this over coffee. My property had been taken under false pretenses. My kids had a completely bogus violation on their record from a summer water fight, and I now had documented time-stamped proof that this wasn't an accident. It was a pattern, deliberate, 3 separate incidents, escalating each time because nobody had pushed back yet. Diane agreed to help. She started pulling every equipment donation file going back 2 years, cross-referencing signatures, building a paper trail that, frankly, was more thorough than anything I could have assembled without her access to the books. Now, here's where the story gets its public unraveling, because up to this point, everything I had was strong on paper but still an internal HOA dispute, the kind of thing that could theoretically get buried in a closed-door board meeting if Kathy played it smart. What actually blew this wide open was something none of us planned, which is often how these things go. Griffin Holt's construction company, using those unfinished model homes as staging sites, had wired temporary power to 2 of them using, you guessed it, my stolen generator alongside a couple of others confiscated the same way. Somebody on the construction crew apparently did a lazy, unpermitted wiring job to run space heaters and lighting inside the model homes to keep pipes from freezing during the cold snap. A neighbor, unrelated to any of this, noticed exposed wiring running along the outside of one of the model homes, and being a decent person who didn't want the whole cul-de-sac to burn down, called the county code enforcement office to report a possible fire hazard. The county sent out a building safety inspector, a woman named Rosa Alvarez, on a Tuesday morning in late January, about 6 weeks after that first snowfall. I happened to be dropping my kids at the bus stop near the entrance when I saw the county truck pull past the gate and head toward the model home lots. Curiosity got the better of me, and honestly, so did instinct. I followed at a distance. By the time I got there, Rosa was already walking the perimeter of the first model home with a clipboard, noting exposed extension cords running from a portable generator into an open window, code violations written all over it. And Kathy Pennington was already there too, practically sprinting across the muddy lot in heeled boots that had no business being anywhere near a construction site, waving her arms. This is private developer property under an active building permit exemption, Kathy announced to Rosa, loud enough that I could hear it from where I'd parked. "The HOA has jurisdiction here, and I need to ask you to hold off on any citations until our property manager reviews the situation." Rosa, to her credit, didn't even look up from her clipboard. "Ma'am, I don't answer to the HOA. This is a county safety inspection based on a citizen complaint about an active electrical hazard. If you interfere with this inspection, that's its own issue." Kathy didn't take the hint. She kept pushing, telling Rosa she'd make some calls, that Rosa's supervisor was a personal friend of the development, implying, none too subtly, that this inspection could go away if Rosa just looked the other way for a few days while things got cleaned up. I was close enough now to hear every word, and I pulled out my phone and started recording, because 10 years of documenting everything for the Army doesn't just switch off when you take the uniform off. Rosa stopped writing and looked directly at Kathy. "Are you asking me to falsify or delay a safety report on an active electrical hazard?" Kathy realized, a half-second too late, how that sounded out loud in front of witnesses, because by then Deshawn had wandered over from his truck, and another neighbor, drawn by the commotion, had stepped out onto her porch to watch. Kathy backpedaled, said she wasn't asking that at all, but the damage was done. Rosa calmly informed her that attempting to influence a county safety inspector was something she was required to document and report, and that she'd be including today's interaction in her official report. That's when I walked up and introduced myself. "Ms. Alvarez, I'm John Wells. That generator running power into this model home is mine. It was taken from me in December under something called an Emergency Resource Directive that doesn't exist in our HOA's actual governing documents. I have GPS records, invoices billed to the developer, and timesheets proving this equipment has been diverted from community use to private construction sites for months." I'll never forget the look on Kathy's face. It wasn't fear exactly, not yet. It was the look of someone doing rapid math on how much of a mess this was about to become. Rosa asked if I could provide documentation, and I told her I could provide a folder thick enough to stop a door. She gave me her card and said the safety violations on site were serious enough on their own: illegal wiring, an ungrounded generator running inside a residential structure without proper ventilation clearance, that this property would be red-tagged that day regardless of anything else going on. But she also said, given what I described, this sounded like something that needed to go beyond her department, likely to the county attorney's office and possibly local law enforcement, given the forged signature and fraudulent billing angle. Word of that scene at the model home spread through Falcon Ridge Estates faster than the actual snowstorm had. By that evening, I had 4 separate neighbors texting me asking what had happened, because apparently half the cul-de-sac had heard about the county inspector red-tagging Griffin Holt's model homes and Kathy Pennington getting caught trying to intimidate her. I called a meeting. Not an official HOA meeting, since I didn't control that calendar, but I asked Diane if she'd be willing to co-host an informational gathering at the clubhouse, open to all homeowners, to lay out exactly what had been happening with our shared equipment and dues money. She agreed without hesitation, and honestly, I think she was relieved to finally be doing something instead of quietly stewing over what her signature had been used for. We held it on a Saturday afternoon in early February, right as the second real cold snap of the season was rolling through, everybody bundled up walking over from their houses, breath clouding in the parking lot. About 30 residents showed up, more than I expected for a subdivision that still only had 26 finished homes. I laid it out plainly, no dramatics, just the facts in order, the way you'd brief a room during a deployment when everybody needs the same information at the same time with no confusion. The August water gun fight and its bogus, written warning that started a fabricated violation history against me. The December snowstorm requisition of my plow and generator, under an emergency resource directive that no board vote ever created. The forged signatures on donation forms for me and at least 2 other residents. The invoices billing Griffin Holt Development for services performed with stolen homeowner equipment and HOA-funded fuel. The timesheets showing HOA-paid contractor hours diverted to private construction lots. And finally, the safety inspection that red-tagged 2 unpermitted model homes running on my confiscated generator, complete with Kathy's attempted intimidation of a county inspector caught on video. I played that video for the room. You could have heard a pin drop until Kathy's line about personal friends with the supervisor hit, and then the room erupted into the kind of angry murmur that tells you people have been feeling something was off for a long time and just needed proof. Diane stood up next and walked everyone through the financial side, how the same signature pattern appeared on multiple donation forms, how invoices to the developer never appeared in any General Assembly disclosure despite state law requiring transparency on association revenue, and how she personally had unknowingly certified budget reports that legitimized theft. Kathy wasn't at that meeting, for what it's worth. Somebody said she'd been asked by Griffin Holt himself to stay away and let him handle it, which tells you a lot about who actually understood how bad this had gotten. The fallout moved fast after that. Rosa Alvarez's safety report, combined with the forged signature evidence Diane and I compiled, got forwarded to the county attorney's Consumer Protection Division, since fraudulent equipment donation forms and false billing to a third party crossed clearly from HOA squabble into criminal fraud and forgery territory. 2 detectives came out to interview me, Diane, Deshawn, and 2 of the other residents whose equipment had been taken under similarly fake paperwork. Kathy Pennington was formally charged about 3 weeks later with forgery and theft by deception, tied specifically to the falsified donation documents and the invoices billed under false pretenses. Griffin Holt himself wasn't charged criminally, since the county determined he'd been billed for services without necessarily knowing the equipment behind them was stolen. But the exposure was enough that state regulators started asking pointed questions about his declarant control period, and whether he'd properly overseen the HOA operations he was legally responsible for as majority board authority. That pressure turned out to matter more than I expected, because under our state's HOA statutes, a declarant who fails to properly administer the association during their control period can be compelled to relinquish board authority early if a sufficient percentage of homeowners petition for it, especially with documented misconduct on record. Diane, now fully on my side and honestly running circles around me on the procedural details, helped organize exactly that petition. We got signatures from every finished household in Falcon Ridge Estates within a week, and Griffin Holt, facing the last thing a developer trying to sell houses wants, which is a public fraud scandal attached to his subdivision's name, agreed to an early transition of board control to elected homeowners rather than drag out a legal fight. The first order of business for that new resident-elected board was reversing every fraudulent lien and fine on record. My $4,200 lien, including the absurd water gun fight violation, got wiped clean, along with similar bogus fines against 3 other households that Kathy had apparently used the same playbook on over the years. Minor manufactured violations stacked up over time to create leverage or justify future, emergency, seizures. My plow attachment and generator came back to me within the week, delivered personally by Deshawn, who I later learned had quietly kept detailed notes of his own about which jobs he was sent to and when, notes that ended up corroborating the timeline investigators built. I shook his hand and told him he did the right thing, and he told me he'd been terrified to say anything until he saw me standing in that muddy lot with my phone out, because it made him realize somebody was finally willing to actually push back. The newsletter box, believe it or not, became something of a running joke in the neighborhood. The new board's very first community-funded purchase was a heavier, weatherproof metal newsletter box to replace the old plastic one. And somebody, I still don't know who, taped a laminated sign to it that just said, "Water gun fight proof, guaranteed." Mason thought that was hilarious. Ellie asked if she could sign it, and I let her, figuring the kid deserved some credit for accidentally kicking off the whole thing that eventually got a corrupt HOA operator arrested. Kathy Pennington's case moved through the court over the following months. I won't pretend I followed every filing closely, since by spring my life had mostly gone back to normal, minus the part where neighbors now waved at me in the driveway with a level of warmth that hadn't existed before, treating me less like the quiet army guy at the end of the cul-de-sac and more like the person who'd actually stood up when it mattered. She eventually pleaded to reduce charges in exchange for restitution to the homeowners whose equipment and fuel costs had been misused, along with a permanent bar from serving on any homeowners association board in the state. Diane told me the restitution check that landed in my account covered not just the fuel and wear on my equipment, but a chunk for what the board's attorney called unlawful deprivation of use, which was a fancier way of saying somebody finally had to pay for taking my stuff. Diane Foster ran for board president in the first fully resident-controlled election that spring and won without opposition. She asked me to serve as the board's facilities liaison mostly, she joked, because I was apparently the only person in the neighborhood who could read a GPS log and a bylaw amendment with equal seriousness. I said yes on one condition, that we actually put an emergency resource directive on the books properly this time, one with a real vote, clear terms, fair compensation for any homeowner equipment used, and a mandatory return timeline. It passed unanimously at the next meeting, 41-0, which for our neighborhood might be a record for the fastest anyone's agreed on anything. By the time the next winter rolled around, Falcon Ridge Estates had 31 finished homes, a functioning elected board, an actual reserve fund Diane could account for down to the penny, and a plow contract with a real company instead of a maintenance shed running on borrowed equipment and forged signatures. When the first snow came that year, I still brought my truck plow out and cleared the access road myself before the contracted crew even got the call, same as I always had, except this time nobody showed up at my door with a clipboard pretending they had the authority to take it from me. Mason and Ellie still play with those shark-shaped water gun attachments every summer, and every single time, without fail, one of them yells across the yard that they'd better not soak the newsletter box or the HOA's going to come get us. It's become a family joke, the kind that only makes sense if you lived through the absurd version of events that started it, a stray splash of water on a plastic mailbox somehow becoming the opening chapter in exposing a fraud scheme that stole thousands of dollars in equipment and fuel from an entire neighborhood. I think about it sometimes, how close all of it came to just quietly working the way Kathy Pennington intended. If I hadn't kept that cheap GPS tracker in my plow out of old habit, if Diane hadn't been the kind of treasurer who actually cared what her signature meant, if that one neighbor hadn't noticed exposed wiring and made a phone call, if Rosa Alvarez had been the kind of inspector willing to look the other way when somebody dropped a vague threat about knowing her supervisor, this whole thing could have stayed buried under paperwork nobody bothered to check. Instead, it turned into the exact kind of accountability that people who abuse a little bit of borrowed authority never expect is coming, right up until it already has. These days, the newsletter box out front still gets the occasional stray splash every summer, and nobody's filed a complaint about it since.